You think that's compassion? Her father's voice cut through the room like shrapnel. That's confusion, Meredith. You're a Marine, not a missionary. She stood there, a baby in her arms, knowing that every regulation said he was right, knowing that her heart said otherwise, and knowing that sometimes the hardest battle isn't the one you fight overseas. It's the one you fight at home, against the people who raised you to follow orders without question. But this wasn't about orders anymore. My name is Captain Meredith Hayes, United States Marine Corps. The night that changed everything didn't begin with gunfire or explosions. It began with silence. The kind of silence that settles over a bombed village after the smoke clears and the survivors have either fled or stopped breathing. We were deployed on humanitarian relief operations following a ceasefire, sweeping through what remained of a small settlement on the outskirts of Al-Rashir. Our mission parameters were straightforward: distribute emergency supplies, assess structural damage, stabilize any survivors we encountered, and document conditions for the relief agencies that would follow. But there are moments when training fails you. When the manual you've memorized cover to cover offers no guidance for what stands in front of you. This was one of those moments. The air was thick with ash and the acrid smell of burnt metal. I moved through the rubble with my squad, our boots crunching on debris that had been someone's home just hours before. My radio crackled with routine reports from other units. Sector 3 clear. No hostile activity. Minimal civilian presence. The words felt hollow against the devastation surrounding us. Buildings reduced to skeletal frames. Vehicles overturned and scorched. Personal belongings scattered like confetti across the cratered earth. Then I heard it. A sound so faint I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. A cry, thin, trembling, barely audible over the wind whistling through broken walls, but unmistakable. A baby's cry. My squad leader, Sergeant Torres, stopped beside me. "Ma'am, did you hear that?" I nodded, already moving toward the sound. We traced it to the collapsed remains of what appeared to have been an aircraft hangar. Part of the roof had caved in, creating a jagged mountain of concrete and twisted rebar. The crying grew louder as we approached, more insistent, as if the child somehow knew we were coming. I called for our medic, Corporal Reeves, and together we began carefully shifting debris. Every piece we moved threatened to destabilize the pile further. Sweat ran down my face despite the cool evening air. My hands shook as I lifted away a broken door panel, half buried under concrete chunks. Beneath it, wrapped in what had once been a Marine Corps flight jacket, was an infant. A baby boy, no more than 6 or 7 months old. His face was grey with soot, his eyes wide and terrified, but he was breathing. Alive. Against every probability, somehow alive. Instinct overwhelmed protocol. I lifted him carefully, feeling for his pulse with trembling fingers. It was there, weak but steady. His tiny body was warm. As I cradled him, something caught the fading light. A silver pendant hung around his neck on a simple chain. It was engraved with coordinates and a single word, Elena. Reeves immediately began checking the baby's vitals while Torres radioed for an emergency medical evacuation. The response came back within minutes, flat and bureaucratic, negative on civilian extraction. Pass non-combatants to local authorities for processing. Continue primary mission. I stared at the radio in disbelief. Repeat that command. You are not authorized to extract non-military personnel. Local infrastructure will handle civilian cases. Over. Torres looked at me, then at the baby, then back at the smoking ruins around us. Ma'am, there is no local infrastructure. There's nothing left. I knew he was right. The village had been evacuated days before the airstrikes. Anyone who'd remained had either been caught in the crossfire or fled into the desert. There were no hospitals, no police, no functioning government offices. Just ash and silence and this child who'd somehow survived. Then we make it our mission, I said quietly, holding the baby closer. We don't leave him. Reeves wrapped the infant in a clean trauma blanket while I examined the flight jacket more carefully. It was severely damaged, burned in places, torn in others. But I could still make out the name tape, partially melted but legible, Cole. Below it, the unmistakable insignia of Marine Corps aviation. Pilot's wings. This jacket belonged to one of ours. Torres, get me everything you can on recent aircraft activity in this sector, I ordered. I want to know if we had any birds go down in this area. While he worked the radio, trying to access mission logs through our limited communications network, I focused on the child. He'd stopped crying now, exhausted and perhaps sensing that he was finally safe. His eyes were starting to close, his breathing evening out. I cleaned his face gently with water from my canteen, revealing olive skin and dark hair beneath the grime. That's when I noticed something else tucked into the remains of the jacket. A photograph creased and partially burned. It showed a female Marine in dress blues standing in front of an aircraft. She wore pilot's wings and the same silver pendant that now hung around the baby's neck. Her smile was confident, radiant even. On the back in faded ink, I could barely make out "To Marcus forever, your wingman." Elena. My throat tightened. This wasn't just any crash site. This was a tomb. We set up a temporary aid station in what remained of an old schoolhouse that night. While the medics treated minor injuries among the few villagers who'd cautiously emerged from hiding, I sat with the baby trying to piece together what had happened. According to Torres's findings, there had been an aircraft incident in this region approximately 8 months earlier. A Marine Osprey conducting humanitarian evacuations had gone down during a severe sandstorm. The official report listed the pilot as missing in action Major Elena Cole. No remains recovered, no survivors found. The search had been called off after 2 weeks when continued hostile activity made the area too dangerous for recovery operations. But clearly someone had survived. At least long enough to hide this child in the safest place she could find before succumbing to her injuries or the elements. I looked down at the sleeping infant in my arms. The pendant gleamed softly in the lamplight. Coordinates etched into its surface. A final message from a mother who'd known she wouldn't survive. The coordinates of this exact location, where she'd hidden her most precious cargo. Except the timeline didn't quite fit. Major Cole had been piloting an evacuation flight. She wouldn't have had her own infant with her on a combat mission. That was impossible. Which meant this child must have been among the civilians she was trying to save. Perhaps orphaned in the initial fighting. Perhaps clinging to life in the chaos of evacuation. And somehow, Major Cole had kept him alive even as her own life slipped away. The image formed in my mind a badly injured pilot. Aircraft destroyed, surrounded by the bodies of those she'd tried to save, with one tiny survivor left in her care. Using her last reserves of strength to wrap him in her jacket, to hide him in the most sheltered spot she could find, to leave him with the only identification she had. Her pendant, her promise that someone would come back. And now, 8 months later, someone finally had. Over the next few days, the bureaucratic nightmare began. I filed incident reports, submitted casualty documentation, requested guidance through every channel available. The responses were uniformly unhelpful. Not our jurisdiction. Contact the State Department. Military personnel cannot assume custody of foreign nationals without proper authorization. But what authorization existed for this? What protocol covered finding the child that a fallen Marine had protected with her dying breath? I called the chaplain, Captain Father Morrison, hoping for guidance. He listened quietly as I explained the situation, then sat in thoughtful silence for a long moment. "Meredith," he finally said, using my first name in that gentle way chaplains have of cutting through rank to reach the person underneath. "Do you know the verse from James? Pure religion is this to look after orphans and widows in their distress. Sometimes our orders come from higher up than any command structure. But, sir, the regulations..." "The regulations," he interrupted gently, "were written by people trying to bring order to chaos. You've been given a different mission. That child survived for a reason. Major Cole kept him alive for a reason. Don't let her sacrifice be for nothing." By the time my deployment officially ended, the baby, whom I'd started calling Ethan, had gained weight, learned to sit up and responded to my voice with gurgles that almost sounded like laughter. My squad had become absurdly protective of him. Torres brought him a rattle fashioned from a spent shell casing. Reeves drew smiley faces on his trauma blanket. Even our hardest gunnery sergeant, a man who'd served in 3 war zones and never shown a crack in his armor, once caught me humming to Ethan and quietly said, "You're doing right by that boy, Captain. Don't let anyone tell you different." But I knew what was coming. The questions. The investigations. The career implications of a Marine officer bringing home an undocumented foreign national. Still, when I looked at Ethan, at the pendant that symbolized one Marine's final act of service, I knew there was only one choice I could live with. I filled out adoption paperwork. Emergency guardianship under wartime humanitarian provisions, a rarely used legal pathway left over from previous conflicts. I signed statement after statement, accepting full responsibility for this child's welfare, education, and future. In the final mission log entry, I wrote simply, One survivor recovered. Condition stable. Action ongoing personal care in honor of Major Elena Cole, USMC, who gave her life protecting him. When our transport aircraft lifted off from the desert airfield, I held Ethan against my chest and watched Al-Rashir disappear beneath the clouds. In my pocket, I carried the burned photograph of Major Cole and a copy of her service record that I'd requested through official channels. Somehow it felt like I was bringing them both home. I had no idea that the hardest battle was just beginning, or that the silver pendant around Ethan's neck held secrets. That would eventually lead me to the one person who'd been searching for answers longer than I had. The plane touched down at Marine Corps Air Station Cherry Point, North Carolina, on a slate-gray winter morning. Cold Atlantic wind whipped across the tarmac as I descended the ramp with Ethan bundled against my chest. At barely over a year old now, he'd grown during our journey, his dark eyes taking in the unfamiliar landscape with solemn curiosity. Immigration processing was a bureaucratic ordeal that tested every ounce of patience I'd developed through military service. The officials couldn't understand why a Marine captain was arriving stateside with an infant who possessed no birth certificate. No passport, no documentation beyond my sworn statements and mission reports. "Captain Hayes," the immigration officer said, peering at me over his reading glasses. "This is highly irregular." "Yes, sir, it is," I agreed. "But irregular circumstances sometimes require irregular solutions." He wasn't satisfied, but after several hours of phone calls to higher authorities and consultation with the base legal office, they granted temporary entry status pending further review. Temporary. That word would haunt me for months. The apartment I'd been assigned on base was small, sparse, furnished with the bare necessities that single officers required. It wasn't designed for a child. I fashioned a makeshift crib from a laundry basket lined with blankets, placed it beside my bed and spent that first night watching Ethan sleep, wondering what I'd gotten myself into. The next morning, I reported to the Judge Advocate General's office for what I'd been told would be a consultation about my situation. Major Thornton, a career JAG officer with a reputation for going by the book, reviewed my file with the kind of cold precision that made me understand why people feared lawyers. "Captain Hayes, you understand that what you've done is legally complicated. I understand that a child needed help, sir, and I was in a position to provide it." He sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "There are proper channels for this sort of thing. International adoption agencies, State Department protocols, humanitarian organizations designed specifically. With respect, sir, none of those things existed in Al-Rashir. There was rubble, there was a child, and there was a dead Marine pilot who'd kept him alive. I made a decision. A decision that could end your career," he said flatly. "You're aware of that?" I met his gaze steadily. What kind of career would I have if I'd walked away? He studied me for a long moment. Then something in his expression softened marginally. "There is a legal framework we can potentially use. Emergency guardianship under the Wartime Humanitarian Adoption Act. It's obscure, rarely invoked, but it exists. However, it requires extensive documentation, background investigations, home studies, and psychological evaluations. It could take months, possibly over a year. And even then, there's no guarantee. I'll do whatever it takes," I said simply. What followed were the most difficult months of my life. Background checks that dredged up every detail of my personal history. Home visits from social workers who scrutinized my living arrangements. Interviews with commanding officers, fellow Marines, even childhood teachers, all asked to assess my fitness as a guardian. Throughout it all, I continued my duties as a Marine officer, training new recruits, managing logistics operations, attending mandatory briefings, while simultaneously caring for a toddler who was learning to walk, and discovering that everything in the world was either fascinating or terrifying or both. The other officers watched with a mixture of admiration and bewilderment. Some offered quiet support, bringing baby supplies or offering to babysit. Others kept their distance, uncomfortable with the sight of a Marine captain changing diapers in the officers' lounge or taking work calls while a child played with blocks at her feet. The whispers followed me everywhere. "Did you hear she brought back a baby from Iraq? Afghanistan. Somewhere over there. Can she even do that? Apparently she's trying." Through it all, Ethan thrived. He grew stronger, healthier, more confident each day. His first clear word was "Mama," spoken one morning as I prepared for PT. I'd stood frozen in the doorway, Unable to move, barely able to breathe, as that simple word rewrote every equation of my life. But the person whose approval I craved most remained conspicuously silent. My father, Colonel Raymond Hayes, retired, 32 years of Marine Corps service, Silver Star recipient, and the man who'd taught me that duty always came before personal comfort. He didn't call, didn't visit, didn't acknowledge the situation at all until nearly 2 months after my return, when he appeared at my door unannounced on a Sunday morning. I opened it to find him standing at attention in civilian clothes, his posture still military perfect despite retirement. His face was carved from stone, unreadable. "So it's true," he said without preamble. "You brought back a child." "Yes, sir," I replied, falling instinctively into the formal tone I'd used with him since childhood. "May I come in?" I stepped aside, and he entered, his gaze sweeping the small apartment with tactical precision. It had changed since he'd last visited. Children's books on the coffee table, a high chair in the kitchen, toys in a basket by the window. Ethan himself was napping on the couch, one small fist curled around his ever-present silver pendant. My father stared at the sleeping child for a long moment before speaking. "You realize what you've done to your career? I've saved a life, sir. Honored a fallen Marine's final act of service. You've complicated everything," he countered, his voice sharp. "You think the Corps will promote an officer who can't separate personal feelings from military duty? You think this shows strength?" The words stung because part of me had feared the same thing. "I think it shows humanity, sir. I think it shows that we fight for something more than just mission objectives." His jaw tightened. "Humanity is what gets Marines killed when they hesitate. When they let emotion cloud judgment, you should have handed that child over to proper authorities." "There were no proper authorities." My voice rose despite my best efforts to remain calm. "Just ruins and chaos, and a baby who would have died if someone hadn't cared more about doing what was right than what was easy." "Easy?" He stepped closer, anger flashing in his eyes. "You think I don't know about hard choices? I've made them for over 3 decades. I've sent men into battles knowing some wouldn't come back. I've written letters to parents who'll never see their children again. I've done what duty required, even when every fibre of my being screamed to do otherwise. That's what being a Marine means." "And what if one of those Marines you sent into battle had been me?" I asked quietly. "What if I'd been the one crying under rubble somewhere, and another captain had walked past because regulations said I wasn't their problem? Would you still call that duty?" He froze. For just a second, something cracked in his armor. Pain, fear, some deep paternal instinct that all his training couldn't quite suppress. Then his face hardened again. "That's different." "Why? Because I'm your daughter." I shook my head. "Every child is someone's daughter, someone's son. Major Elena Cole died protecting this boy. She used her last breaths to give him a chance. I'm just honoring that sacrifice." "Elena Cole," he repeated slowly. "I knew her. Damn fine pilot." He looked back at Ethan, and something in his expression shifted. "She went down on an evac run." "Yes, sir. And somehow she kept this child alive long enough to hide him where he'd be found." My father was quiet for a long time, wrestling with thoughts I couldn't read. Finally, he said, "Your mother would have understood this. She always said I confused strength with hardness." He moved toward the door, then paused. "But don't let sentiment weaken you, Meredith. The Corps doesn't reward soft hearts." "It's not sentiment," I said to his back. "It's service. Just a different kind." He left without another word, but something had shifted between us. A crack in the wall that had stood for so long. The guardianship process crawled forward at bureaucratic speed. More interviews, more paperwork, more scrutiny. But slowly, incrementally, the case began to solidify. Character witnesses testified to my stability and dedication. Medical reports confirmed Ethan's health and well-being under my care. Even my commanding officer, initially skeptical, eventually wrote a letter of support. "Captain Hayes has demonstrated exceptional judgment and moral courage," his statement read. "Her actions reflect the highest ideals of Marine Corps values: honor, courage, and commitment to those who cannot protect themselves." 11 months after I first held Ethan in that ruined hangar, I received the notification I'd been waiting for. Final hearing scheduled, courthouse. Dress blues required. I drove there on a crisp autumn morning with Ethan buckled in his car seat, wearing tiny khaki pants and a polo shirt I'd bought specifically for the occasion. At 2 years old now, he was talking in full sentences, asking endless questions about everything he saw. "Where are we going, Mama?" To see a judge, sweetheart. What's a judge? Someone who helps make important decisions. About what? I glanced at him in the rearview mirror. This beautiful, curious, resilient child who'd somehow survived war and loss to find his way into my life. About making sure we stay together. The judge was an older woman, Judge Patricia Morrison, with kind eyes and grey hair pulled back in a neat bun. She'd reviewed every document, read every statement, and interviewed me personally in chambers before the formal hearing. Now, with Ethan sitting beside me clutching a toy fighter jet, she looked at us both with an expression I couldn't quite read. Captain Hayes, she began, I've presided over hundreds of adoption cases in my career. Most follow predictable patterns. But this case is unlike any I've encountered. She paused, and my heart hammered against my ribs, which makes it all the more remarkable that the decision is so clear. Relief flooded through me. You acted without official sanction, without proper authorization, in defiance of regulations that exist for good reason. You complicated your career, risked disciplinary action, and created a diplomatic headache that required intervention at the highest levels. She smiled then, genuine warmth breaking through judicial formality. And you did exactly what any decent human being should have done. You saw a child in need and refused to look away. She signed the papers with deliberate care. By the authority vested in me by the state of North Carolina, I hereby grant full legal adoption. Ethan James Hayes is now your son in every legal sense. Captain Hayes, you are now officially his mother. I couldn't speak, could barely breathe. Just signed where she indicated and held Ethan close as tears I'd been holding back for nearly a year finally fell. That night, my father called. His voice was gruff but quieter than I'd heard it in years. Your mother would have been proud, he said simply. Thank you, sir. Raymond, he corrected. When it's about family, you can call me Raymond. Or Dad, if you're feeling particularly bold. I smiled through fresh tears. Thank you, Dad. Don't make a habit of defying regulations, he added, but I could hear the hint of something that might have been pride beneath the stern words. But if you had to defy them, I suppose protecting a Marine's final mission wasn't the worst reason. Life settled into a new normal after that. I balanced military duty with motherhood, learning to navigate the complicated terrain of single parenting while maintaining the discipline and focus required of a Marine officer. It wasn't easy. There were mornings when I showed up to training exercises exhausted from midnight wake-ups, evenings when I reviewed intelligence briefings while simultaneously helping Ethan with toddler-level puzzles. Moments when I questioned whether I could really do both, but then Ethan would laugh at something silly, or trace the coordinates on his pendant and ask about the sky lady who'd given it to him. And I'd remember why none of it was negotiable. This child was my mission now, just as much as any deployment had ever been. I told him stories about Major Elena Cole, the brave pilot who'd saved him. She flew into dangerous places to help people, I'd say, tucking him in at night. She made sure you were safe even when she couldn't save herself. That's what heroes do. Are you a hero too, Mama? He once asked. I just tried to finish what she started, sweetheart. The years passed with surprising speed. Ethan grew from toddler to preschooler, curious and bright, with an inexplicable fascination with aircraft that I suspected had something to do with the pendant he never took off. He'd spend hours watching planes take off from the base, tracing their paths across the sky with one finger. My father gradually became a fixture in our lives. He'd stop by with tools to fix things that didn't need fixing, teaching Ethan how to use a hammer properly and change a tire. The gruff exterior remained, but underneath, I could see the grandfather emerging. The man who'd probably wanted to be this way with me but hadn't known how. One spring afternoon, as we sat on my back porch watching Ethan play in the yard, my father asked, "You ever look up those coordinates?" I'd wondered the same thing countless times, running my thumb over the engraved numbers while Ethan slept. I started to once, but then I stopped. Why? Because they lead back to loss, I said quietly. To the place where Major Cole died. I didn't want Ethan's story to begin with tragedy. I wanted it to begin with survival, with hope. He nodded slowly. Maybe someday he'll need to know. Maybe, I agreed, when he's ready. I had no idea how soon that day would come, or that the truth waiting in those coordinates would change everything we thought we understood about Ethan's story. It started with an envelope bearing an official military seal. I'd received plenty of those over the years. Routine correspondence that came with being an active duty officer. But this one felt different somehow. heavier than mere paper should be. You are cordially invited to the Marine Corps Heritage Banquet. It read, honoring distinguished service in humanitarian operations. My name was on the list of recipients, alongside dozens of others who'd served in relief missions over the past decade. The ceremony would take place in 6 weeks at the Officers' Club, black tie optional, families welcome. I set the invitation on the kitchen counter and went back to making breakfast, telling myself it was just another military function. But something nagged at me, a feeling I couldn't name, as if the universe was slowly aligning pieces on a chessboard I couldn't yet see. Ethan, now 5 years old and starting kindergarten, was fascinated by the formal invitation. What's this, Mama? It's for a ceremony where they give people awards for helping others. His eyes widened. Are you getting an award? Maybe a certificate or something small. It's not a big deal. But the more I thought about it, the more it felt like something significant. These ceremonies were usually small, quiet affairs. This one, according to the invitation, would have a guest speaker from Washington, a 4-star general whose name caught my attention. General Marcus Cole. The name resonated like a struck bell. Cole. The name on the flight jacket. The name on the back of that photograph I still kept locked in my fireproof box. Could it be related? The Corps had thousands of officers named Cole. It had to be a coincidence. Still, I found myself researching him late that night after Ethan was asleep. General Marcus Cole, decorated veteran, multiple combat tours, currently serving as humanitarian operations advisor to the Joint Chiefs. Vidova. Wife lost in action 2003. Wife Major Elena Cole. Marine Corps aviator. Missing in action, presumed dead. My hands trembled as I read the details. The dates aligned. The location matched. This was him. The man whose wife had saved Ethan. The man who'd been searching for closure for over 5 years. And in 6 weeks, I'd be in the same room with him. I opened the fireproof box and pulled out the photograph, studying Elena Cole's face in the lamplight. She'd been beautiful, confident, every inch a Marine officer. And somewhere, her husband had been living with the incomplete grief of not knowing exactly what had happened, of never having remains to bury, of questions that could never be fully answered. I thought about the pendant around Ethan's neck, about the coordinates engraved there, pointing back to the place where she'd made her final stand, about the burned flight jacket and the torn photograph and all the pieces of evidence I'd collected but never fully examined. Maybe my father was right. Maybe it was time for the truth, however painful it might be. Over the next few weeks, I prepared for the banquet with more care than I'd given any military function in years. I had my dress blues cleaned and pressed, my ribbons properly aligned, my shoes polished until they reflected like dark mirrors. I bought Ethan a small suit jacket and taught him proper manners for formal military events, how to shake hands firmly, how to say sir and ma'am without sounding rehearsed, how to stand still when required but not be stiff. Why is this one special? He asked as I adjusted his clip-on tie for the 3rd time. Because we're going to meet people who knew the Sky Lady, I said carefully. The one who protected you. His hand went instinctively to the pendant. Will they be sad? Maybe, I admitted. But maybe they'll also be happy to know that what she did mattered. That you're here because she was brave. The night before the banquet, my father stopped by unannounced. As was his habit, he found me standing in front of the mirror in my dress blues, adjusting the Bronze Star ribbon I'd been awarded for the Al-Rashir operation. You look sharp, he said gruffly. Thank you. He watched me for a moment, then said, You know who'll be there tomorrow. I do. You planning to tell him? I met my father's eyes in the mirror. I don't know. What would you do? He was quiet for a long time. I'd tell him the truth. A Marine deserves to know what happened to his wife, even if it's hard. Especially if it's hard. He placed a small velvet box on my dresser. Your mother's pearl earrings. She wore them to every military function she attended. Said they reminded her that grace and strength weren't opposites. I opened the box carefully, touching the smooth pearls with reverent fingers. I miss her. Me too, kiddo. He cleared his throat, but she'd be proud of you. Hell, I'm proud of you, even if I'm not always good at showing it. The next evening arrived with unseasonable warmth, spring pushing early into March. Ethan and I dressed carefully, moving through the rituals of preparation like we were suiting up for battle. In a way, we were. Not a battle of weapons and tactics, but one of truth and memory and the courage to face both. We picked up my father on the way to the base. He wore his old service uniform, still fitting him perfectly despite retirement. Ribbons and medals earned across 3 decades telling their own story across his chest. "You ready for this?" he asked as I helped Ethan into his booster seat. "No," I admitted. "But I don't think there's any such thing as being ready." The officers' club had been transformed for the occasion. White tablecloths, formal place settings, flower arrangements that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. A brass quartet played softly near the entrance, while Marines in dress uniform mingled with civilian dignitaries and retired officers. We found our assigned table near the front, table 6, just off the main stage. The placement wasn't accidental. This close to the podium, we'd have a clear view of everything, including the guest speaker. My father sat with military posture, spine straight, eyes forward. Ethan bounced slightly in his seat, fascinated by the formality and spectacle. I felt somewhere between them, grounded and restless at once, waiting for something I couldn't name. The ceremony began with the national anthem, everyone rising as the colours were presented. Then came the invocation, a prayer for those serving overseas and those who'd given their lives in service. I felt Ethan's small hand slip into mine and I squeezed gently. The program moved through various presentation certificates for logistics teams, commendations for medical units, recognition for engineers who'd rebuilt schools and hospitals in war-torn regions. Each story was its own testament to what military service could mean beyond combat. Then the master of ceremonies stepped to the microphone with a different energy, his voice carrying weight that the previous announcements hadn't held. Our keynote speaker tonight needs no introduction to those who've served in humanitarian operations over the past 2 decades. General Marcus Cole has dedicated his career not just to defending our nation, but to rebuilding what war destroys. As commander of humanitarian operations and advisor to the Joint Chiefs, he's been instrumental in shaping how our military engages with civilian populations in crisis zones. The room erupted in respectful applause. I found myself clapping mechanically, heart hammering as a tall figure emerged from the wings. General Marcus Cole was in his mid-50s, grey threading through dark hair that had once been black. His uniform was immaculate, 4 stars gleaming on each shoulder, ribbons covering his chest in orderly rows that spoke of a career spanning continents and decades. But it was his eyes that struck me most. They carried a particular kind of weariness that no amount of military bearing could fully conceal. The exhaustion of someone who'd been searching for something they'd never quite found. He stood at the podium and waited for the applause to fade before speaking. His voice was measured, controlled, but underneath I detected something more fragile. "Thank you for that generous introduction. I've been asked to speak tonight about courage in humanitarian service, and I've spent the past few weeks trying to figure out what that really means." He paused, gaze sweeping the room. "We often think of courage as something that happens on battlefields. Charging an enemy position, holding ground under fire. Those are certainly courageous acts. But I've come to believe that some of the bravest people I've known never fired a weapon." He continued, telling stories of medical personnel who'd worked in epidemic zones, engineers who'd rebuilt infrastructure under threat of attack, logistics officers who'd ensured food reached starving populations. His words were eloquent, carefully chosen, but I could sense the personal weight behind them. "My wife was a Marine Corps pilot," he said suddenly, and the room went very still. "Major Elena Cole. She flew humanitarian evacuation missions in some of the most dangerous airspace imaginable. In 2003, her aircraft went down during a severe sandstorm while attempting to extract civilians from a contested zone." His voice caught just slightly before he continued. "We never recovered her remains. Never got full answers about what happened in those final moments. For years, I struggled with that incomplete grief, that not knowing. It's a particular kind of torture, I think, to have questions that can never be fully answered." He looked down at the podium, gathering himself. "But over time, I've learned that the not knowing isn't the point. What matters is that she went. That when people needed help, she flew toward danger instead of away from it. That's the courage we're honoring tonight. The people who hear a cry for help and refuse to walk away." His eyes lifted, scanning the audience, and for just a second they passed over our table. Over me, over my father, over Ethan with his hand unconsciously touching the silver pendant at his throat. General Cole continued speaking, but I barely heard the words. I was too focused on that pendant catching the chandelier light, too aware of how close we were to a truth that had been waiting 5 years to emerge. When the speech concluded, the room stood in unanimous applause. The general returned to his seat at the head table, and the ceremony moved into its next phase: individual recognitions. My name was called. I stood, legs feeling disconnected from my body, and made my way to the stage. The commandant shook my hand and presented me with a framed certificate commemorating the Al-Rashir operation. Captain Meredith Hayes, he read from the citation, for extraordinary compassion and decisive action in recovering and safeguarding a child survivor from a combat zone, demonstrating the highest ideals of Marine Corps values. Her actions resulted in the successful placement of an orphaned infant and honored the sacrifice of a fallen Marine aviator. The applause felt distant underwater. I accepted the certificate, shook hands, returned to my seat in a daze, because I'd seen General Cole's face as the citation was read, seen the way his head snapped up, the way his eyes locked onto me with sudden intense focus. He knew, or at least suspected. The formal program concluded and the crowd began to mingle. Officers gathered in clusters, trading stories and catching up with old comrades. My father engaged in conversation with a retired colonel he'd served with decades ago. I stood near our table, one hand on Ethan's shoulder, trying to decide whether to seek out General Cole or let fate make the decision. Fate chose for me. A young aide approached, a lieutenant with fresh gold bars and nervous energy. "Excuse me, Captain Hayes." The general wondered if he might have a moment of your time. My mouth went dry. "Of course. He's in the side gallery, ma'am. Just through those doors." I looked down at Ethan, then at my father, who nodded slightly. "Go. We'll be here." I found General Cole standing in front of a wall displaying photographs of Marines in humanitarian missions. His back was to me, hands clasped behind him in a posture of military rest that somehow conveyed anything but peace. "General Cole?" He turned slowly. Up close, away from the formality of the ceremony, he looked older than his years, the kind of aging that comes from carrying too much for too long. "Captain Hayes, thank you for coming." He gestured to one of the photographs on the wall. It showed a young woman in Marine flight blues, standing in front of an Osprey aircraft, smiling with confidence and joy. The same woman from the photograph in my fireproof box. "Major Elena Cole," he said softly. "My wife. Taken about 6 months before her final mission." I stood beside him, studying the image. She was beautiful. She was everything, he corrected gently. Then, turning to look at me directly, "Captain, your citation mentioned recovering a child from Al-Rashir. From a hangar site in 2008. "Yes, sir." His jaw worked, emotions warring across his face. That's the sector where Elena went down. We searched for weeks, but the area was too hot to maintain operations. Eventually, we had to call it off." His voice dropped to almost a whisper. "Can you tell me what you found there?" I took a breath, then told him everything. The collapsed hangar, the baby wrapped in a flight jacket bearing the name Cole, the photograph I'd recovered, the pendant with coordinates engraved on it. Every detail I'd documented, every piece of evidence I'd carefully preserved. By the time I finished, General Cole had his hand braced against the wall, head bowed, shoulders shaking with silent emotion. "She survived the crash," he finally said, voice raw. "She survived and she kept him alive." "I believe so, sir." "The evidence suggests she protected him for several days, possibly longer before her injuries." I couldn't finish the sentence. He wiped his eyes roughly. "This child. The boy you adopted. Do you have him here tonight?" "Yes, sir. He's with my father at our table." "May I?" He looked at me with desperate hope. "May I meet him?" We walked back into the main hall together. My father saw us coming and stood, understanding passing between us without words. Ethan looked up from the dessert he'd been systematically destroying, frosting on his chin. "Ethan," I said gently, "this is General Cole. He's someone very important I'd like you to meet." Ethan wiped his mouth with a napkin, then stood and extended his hand exactly as I'd taught him. "Nice to meet you, sir." General Cole knelt down, bringing himself to eye level. His hand trembled slightly as he shook Ethan's. "The pleasure is mine, young man. That's a beautiful pendant you're wearing." Ethan's hand went to it instinctively. "Thank you. My mama says it was from a brave sky lady." Something broke across the general's face. He looked at the pendant, then at Ethan, then at me with an expression that contained universes of grief and gratitude and disbelief. "She was very brave," he managed. "The bravest person I ever knew." "Did you know her?" Ethan asked with the innocent directness of children. "I did." General Cole's voice cracked. "I knew her very well." My father cleared his throat softly. General, perhaps we should continue this conversation somewhere more private. Yes. Yes, of course. The general straightened, regaining his military composure, though his eyes remained wet. Captain Hayes, if you're willing, I'd like to discuss this further. There are questions I've had for years that perhaps you can help answer. I have some items I think should be returned to you, sir, I said quietly. The photograph, parts of her flight jacket, other personal effects. He pressed his hand to his mouth, nodding wordlessly. We arranged to meet the following day at his office on base. For now, we stood in this awkward, sacred space, 5 years of unknown finally beginning to resolve into truth. Ethan tugged on my hand. Mama, is the general sad? Yes, sweetheart. But sometimes people need to feel sad before they can feel better. General Cole managed a smile. Your mother is a very wise woman, Ethan. That night, after the ceremony ended and we drove home through darkness punctuated by streetlights, Ethan fell asleep in the back seat, clutching his pendant. My father sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window. You did good tonight, he finally said. That can't have been easy. It was necessary, I replied. He deserves to know what happened to his wife. To understand that her final act was protecting a child. That has to mean something. It means everything, my father said quietly. When we got home, I carried Ethan inside without waking him and tucked him into bed, pendant still clasped in his small fist. Then I went to the garage and retrieved the fireproof box. Inside was everything I'd kept from that day in Al-Rashir, the photograph. The mission reports, scraps of Elena Cole's flight jacket with her name still partially visible. The envelope containing coordinates and personal effects. I laid them out on the kitchen table like pieces of a puzzle that had finally found their picture. My father joined me, handing me a cup of tea I hadn't asked for but needed. We sat in silence for a while, studying the fragments of a story that had taken 5 years to tell. What do you think happens now? I asked. I think a man gets some closure, he said. I think a boy learns about the woman who saved him. And I think you finally put down a weight you've been carrying longer than you realized. The meeting the next morning was scheduled for 0900 hours at General Cole's office in the Pentagon Annex on base. I drove there alone, leaving Ethan with my father carrying the fireproof box like sacred cargo. The general's aide showed me into a spacious office with windows overlooking the parade ground. General Cole stood as I entered, and I was struck again by how much older he looked than his official photographs. Grief ages people in ways that time alone cannot. Captain Hayes, thank you for coming. He gestured to a chair. Please sit. I placed the box on his desk. Sir, I believe these belong to you. His hands hesitated over it as if afraid of what opening it might mean. Then, with visible effort, he lifted the lid. The photograph was on top. He lifted it with trembling fingers, staring at his wife's smile. I haven't seen this picture in years, he whispered. She sent it to me from her deployment. Said it was so I'd remember her exactly as she was, not as I worried she might become. She looks happy, I said softly. She was. Flying was everything to her. Helping people, making a difference, that's what drove her. He set the photograph down gently and picked up the scorched fabric. Her flight jacket. I'm sorry I couldn't preserve more of it. The fire damage was extensive. He traced the name tape with one finger. You preserved what mattered. You preserved the child she died protecting. He looked up at me, eyes bright. Captain, I need to know everything. From the beginning, no matter how difficult. So I told him. Every detail of that night in Al-Rashir. The cry I'd heard under rubble. The collapsed hangar. Finding Ethan wrapped in her jacket, still alive despite all probability. The coordinates on the pendant matching the crash site exactly. She must have survived the initial impact, I explained, pulling out the mission reports. Based on the evidence, I believe she sheltered in that hangar for several days, possibly longer. The child I found, Ethan, he was approximately 6 to 7 months old at the time. Small enough that she could protect him with her own body. General Cole listened with the intensity of someone memorizing every word. But where did he come from? Eleanor wasn't pregnant when she deployed. She would have told me. I don't believe he was hers biologically, sir. Based on the timeline and circumstances, my assessment is that he was among the civilians she was evacuating. Perhaps orphaned in the initial fighting. Perhaps separated from family in the chaos. She kept him alive even as her own injuries worsened. He was quiet for a long time processing this. So she didn't just survive the crash. She survived long enough to save a child who wasn't even hers. Yes, sir. That's what the evidence suggests. And when she knew she couldn't survive much longer, She hid him in the safest place she could find, wrapped in her jacket with her identification, trusting that someone would eventually come back, that someone would finish what she started. His shoulders shook. That sounds exactly like something Elena would do. She never knew how to quit, never knew when to save herself instead of saving others. He wiped his eyes. I've spent 5 years wondering how she died, whether she suffered, whether she thought of me in those final moments. And now? Now you know she spent them protecting an innocent life, I said gently. She spent them being exactly who she always was. A Marine. A pilot. A hero. He nodded slowly, grief and pride warring on his face. Then he asked the question I'd been expecting. This boy, Ethan, may I? Would it be possible for me to be part of his life? I'd thought about this question extensively since the banquet. General, with respect, Ethan is my son legally and in every way that matters. I won't allow his life to be disrupted or his stability compromised. I understand. I'm not asking to take him from you. I'm asking. He struggled to find words. I'm asking if I might be allowed to know him, to tell him about Elena, to be present as he grows up. I've lost so much, Captain. If there's a chance to have some connection to what Elena gave her life protecting, His voice broke. I softened. Sir, I think we can arrange something, but it has to be on terms that prioritize Ethan's well-being. Gradual. Careful. No sudden changes or demands. Of course. Whatever you think is best. He looked at me with desperate gratitude. Thank you, Captain. You've given me more than you know. We discussed logistics, boundaries, next steps. He would undergo background screening even though his security clearance was already beyond question. We'd arrange supervised visits, starting with casual outings, letting Ethan adjust gradually to having another adult in his life. I'm not trying to replace you as his parent, General Cole emphasized. I need him to know about Elena, to understand what she did, to know that her sacrifice meant something. He will, I promised. I'll make sure he understands exactly how special she was. As I prepared to leave, the General stopped me. Captain Hayes, there's one more thing. Those coordinates on the Pendant, do you know what they lead to? The crash site, I assume. More than that. He pulled out a map and plotted the coordinates. This is the exact location where we held Elena's memorial service. We couldn't bury her, but we could honor her. I chose those coordinates specifically. It's where her squadron gathered to say goodbye. My throat tightened. She wanted him found there. She wanted him brought back to a place that meant something. Yes, he said softly. One last mission, one final evacuation. And you completed it for her. Over the following weeks, General Cole began carefully integrating himself into our lives. He came to dinner once, awkward but earnest, bringing dessert as I'd requested. He attended one of Ethan's T-ball games, sitting in the bleachers beside my father. Two Marines bonding over a 5-year-old's enthusiastic if inaccurate attempt at sports. Ethan adapted with the resilience of children. He liked General Marcus, liked the stories about airplanes, liked the way this serious man would sit on the floor and build Lego sets with focused intensity. Is he like a grandpa? Ethan asked one night. Something like that, I agreed. Someone who cares about you very much. Because of the Sky Lady. Because of the Sky Lady, I confirmed. And because you're a pretty special kid. My father, watching this unfold, seemed to soften in ways I hadn't thought possible. One Saturday, I found him and General Cole in my driveway, both under the hood of my car, teaching Ethan about engine maintenance. The boy should know practical skills, my father was saying. Agreed, General Cole replied. Eleanor always said Marines who couldn't fix their own equipment were only half-trained. They were bonding over shared loss, shared military service, and shared love for a child who'd survived against impossible odds. 3 months after the banquet, we held a small ceremony at the base chapel. Just my father, General Cole, Ethan, and myself. We gathered around a newly installed plaque honoring Major Elena Cole's service and sacrifice. To Major Elena Cole, USMC, the inscription read, who gave her life protecting those who could not protect themselves. Her final mission was completed by Captain Meredith Hayes, who carried home the child Elena died saving, in honor of courage, compassion, and the promise that no one is ever truly lost. General Cole read from a prepared statement, but his voice kept breaking. Eleanor believed that service meant more than wearing a uniform. It meant showing up when needed, even when it cost everything. She lived that belief until her last breath. And through Captain Hayes's compassion, her sacrifice continues to matter. He knelt down and looked at Ethan. Your Sky Lady, Elena, she loved you even though she'd never met you before that day. She loved you because that's what Marines do. We protect those who can't protect themselves. And I'm going to make sure you grow up knowing that you're alive because someone cared enough to refuse to quit." Ethan nodded solemnly, then surprised us all by removing his pendant and holding it out. "Do you want to wear it, since she was your wife?" General Cole's composure shattered. He pulled Ethan into a hug, shoulders shaking. "No, buddy. That's yours. She gave it to you. But maybe sometimes you could tell me stories about it." "Okay," Ethan agreed easily. "And you can tell me stories about her?" "Every single one I remember," the general promised. That summer we began a new tradition. Once a month we'd all gather, my father, General Cole, Ethan, and myself for what we called Sky Lady Days. We'd visit air museums, watch planes take off from the base, build model aircraft, and share stories about Elena Cole's service. Ethan learned that his Sky Lady had flown over 50 humanitarian missions, that she'd evacuated hundreds of civilians from war zones, that she'd received multiple commendations for bravery under fire, that she'd been funny and kind and stubborn and brilliant. "She sounds cool," Ethan declared after one of these sessions. "She was the coolest," General Cole agreed, smiling through perpetual sadness. As for me, I watched these bonds form with gratitude and caution in equal measure. Ethan was thriving, secure in the knowledge that he was loved by multiple people who'd come together through tragedy and choice. My relationship with General Cole evolved into something like friendship, forged in the unique circumstances of shared grief and shared purpose. He never overstepped, never demanded more than was offered, always mindful that Ethan was my son first. "You gave me back a future I thought I'd lost," he told me once. "I'll never be able to repay that." "You already have," I replied. "You've shown Ethan that the woman who saved him was worth remembering." That's all I ever wanted. 2 years after the banquet, the Marine Corps hosted another heritage ceremony. This one focused specifically on fallen aviators and the missions they'd completed. General Cole was asked to speak again, but this time he requested that I share the podium. We stood together before an audience of Marines and military families, and he told Elena's story, not the sanitized version from official reports, but the real story. How she'd survived a crash only to spend her final days protecting a child. How a captain had heard that child's cry and refused to walk away. How compassion had completed what catastrophe had begun. When it was my turn to speak, I kept it simple. Major Elena Cole taught me that being a Marine isn't about following orders blindly. It's about understanding what those orders are meant to protect. She protected an innocent life with her last breaths. I simply honored that by finishing her mission. That's what we do. We don't leave each other behind.
Not our fellow Marines, and not the people they die protecting.
The applause was thunderous, but more importantly, I saw tears. Hardened combat veterans wiping their eyes. Officers who'd commanded battalions struggling with emotion. Because this story represented something they all understood, that service means sacrifice. And sometimes the greatest sacrifice is dying alone so someone else can live. Afterward, a young female lieutenant approached me. "Mom, I just wanted to say thank you. I'm about to deploy for my first humanitarian mission, and I've been scared. But hearing Major Cole's story, seeing what you did, it reminds me why I signed up. Why any of this matters." I gripped her shoulder. "Come home safe, Lieutenant. And if you hear someone crying in the rubble, don't walk past." "Never, Mom," she promised. Ethan continued to grow, asking harder questions as he got older. About war and death and why people hurt each other. I answered as honestly as age-appropriate language allowed, always bringing it back to the same theme that even in the darkest circumstances, people make choices. Elena chose to protect him. I chose to bring him home. General Cole chose to be present. My father chose to soften his rigid military worldview. "Why did all these people choose me?" Ethan asked once. "Because you were worth choosing," I said simply. "And because choosing you helped all of us remember what we're supposed to be fighting for." By the time Ethan started 3rd grade, our unconventional family had solidified into something normal, at least for us. Weekend fishing trips with Grandpa Raymond and Uncle Marcus, as Ethan had started calling them. School projects where he'd proudly tell classmates about his Sky Lady who'd saved him. Parent-teacher conferences where 3 adults showed up to advocate for 1 child. Other parents sometimes looked at us oddly, this female Marine captain, her stern retired colonel father, and a 4-star general, all orbiting around one small boy, but we didn't care. We'd been forged in circumstances most people couldn't comprehend. Their confusion was understandable. One evening, as I tucked Ethan into bed, he asked, "Mama, when I grow up, can I be a Marine too?" I thought about discouraging him, about steering him towards safer paths. But that wouldn't honor Elena's memory or my own service. If that's what you choose, I'll be proud. But remember, being a Marine isn't about uniforms and weapons. It's about standing up when others sit down, showing up when others turn away. If you can do that in whatever you become, you'll honor your Sky Lady's memory. He nodded, thinking this over with 9-year-old seriousness. I think she'd want me to help people. I think she would too. As the years passed, the raw edges of our story softened into something closer to peace. General Cole never fully recovered from losing Elena. That kind of grief doesn't have an expiration date. But he found purpose in being part of Ethan's life. My father never became overtly affectionate, but his gruff exterior concealed genuine love that showed in steady presence. And me? I learned that sometimes the bravest thing a Marine can do isn't charging into battle. Sometimes it's refusing to leave a child behind, even when every regulation says you should. Sometimes it's defying your own father's expectations to follow your conscience. Sometimes it's completing a mission that started in rubble and ends in redemption. The pendant still hung around Ethan's neck, coordinates pointing back to where life had almost ended but instead somehow found a way to continue. Those numbers no longer represented just a crash site. They represented the place where Elena Cole's final act of service intersected with my first, truly independent moral choice. Where tragedy met compassion and produced something neither of us could have imagined. I kept the photograph of Eleanor on my dresser now, no longer hidden in a fireproof box. Ethan would sometimes stand in front of it, studying her smile, and I'd watch him search for resemblances that weren't genetic but spiritual. The determination in his eyes. The instinct to help when someone was hurt. The refusal to quit even when circumstances seemed impossible. She'd saved him with her body. I'd saved him with my choice. But he was saving all of us with his existence, reminding us daily that life persists despite war's best efforts to extinguish it. On the 10th anniversary of finding Ethan, now a confident 15-year-old who'd inherited Elena's passion for aviation and my stubborn streak, we returned to Al-Rashir. It had been rebuilt, transformed from ruins into a functioning town with schools and hospitals and families living ordinary lives. General Cole, now retired, came with us, as did my father. We stood at the site where the hangar had once collapsed, now marked with a small memorial garden maintained by the local community. They never forgot, a local translator told us. The Marine who saved the boy. The Sky Lady who protected him. These stories matter here. Ethan placed flowers at the memorial, then turned to General Cole. Do you think she knew that I'd grow up safe, that people would remember? General Cole's voice was rough with emotion. I think she hoped. That's all any of us can do in the moment. Hope that our choices matter. Trust that someone will finish what we start. He looked at me, and she was right to hope. We stood together in that garden, 4 people bound by circumstance and choice, surrounded by the evidence that life insists on continuing. That compassion matters. That sometimes, against all logic, the right thing to do is also the possible thing to do. As we flew home, Ethan sat between General Cole and me, the pendant catching the airplane cabin's fluorescent light. He'd stopped asking about the coordinates years ago. He knew where they led. He knew what they meant. He knew that some directions don't point to places but to promises kept. And as I looked out the window at clouds that could have hidden enemy aircraft or friendly skies, that could have carried Elena Cole to her death or Ethan toward his life, I understood something fundamental about service. It's not about medals or promotions or even about following orders. It's about hearing a cry in darkness and refusing to keep walking. It's about finishing missions that others start, honoring sacrifices that others make, and understanding that sometimes disobedience is the highest form of duty. Elena Cole taught me that, a woman I never met. A Marine whose final act was protecting someone else's child. A pilot whose last flight led nowhere, but whose courage pointed toward everything that mattered. When we tell this story now, people often ask if I have regrets. If I'd make the same choice again, knowing how it would complicate my career, strain my family relationships, and force me to defy every regulation I'd been trained to follow. The answer is always the same. I'd do it 1,000 times over. Because Ethan is alive. Because General Cole found a connection to the wife he'd lost. Because my father learned that strength includes gentleness. Because a young female lieutenant once told me that this story gave her courage to serve. Because some missions aren't in the manual. Some orders come from deeper than command structures. Some promises are kept in the silence between heartbeats, when you hear a cry and your soul says not on my watch. That's what Major Elena Cole understood in her final moments. That's what she trusted me to remember. And that's what I'll teach every young Marine who asks why any of this matters. We don't leave each other behind. Not our fellow warriors. Not the people they die protecting. Not the promises made in darkness or the hope that persists through devastation. We finish the mission. Always. Even when the mission is simply loving a child who survived when he shouldn't have. Even when it means carrying that love across years and oceans and the complicated terrain of grief and healing. Especially then. Because in the end, that's the only mission that truly matters. That's the only order worth following without question. Love first. Figure out the rest later. And trust that somewhere, somehow, a fallen Marine is watching with approval, knowing her final evacuation was successful. Knowing the child she died protecting grew up surrounded by people who understood exactly what her sacrifice meant. Knowing she completed her mission after all.